After the slaughter of World War I, France swore that such horror would never happen again. The memory of trenches filled with mud, blood, and broken men haunted an entire generation. From the smallest village to the grand boulevards of Paris, almost every French family carried the scars of the war. Out of that trauma grew a promise. If another German invasion came, France would be ready. The answer to that promise was the Maginot Line, a vast wall of steel and concrete that its builders believed could shield the nation forever. It was not just a military project, but a national obsession, an effort to make the past impossible to repeat. And yet, for all its ambition and all its expense, the Maginot Line would go on to become one of the greatest failures in military history. But before we reach its fall, we need to understand its rise. The idea of the Maginot Line was born in the late 1920s, a decade after the armistice that ended the First World War. France had fought that war on its own soil, and the devastation was unmatched. Northern towns and villages were obliterated. Farmland became wasteland, and entire generations of young men had been wiped out. The French leadership, scarred by those memories, knew that another conflict with Germany was not just possible, but likely. Germany had been defeated and humiliated by the Treaty of Versailles, but few in France believed that humiliation would last forever. The only question was when Germany would rise again. For military planners, the answer was simple. If the Germans were coming back, then France needed a way to stop them at the border. No more long retreats, no more desperate last stands. Instead, France would build a permanent shield, one so strong that German armies would never be able to break through. The man most associated with this vision was Maginot, the French Minister of War in the early 1930s. Maginot was himself a veteran of the First World War, a man who had lived the terror of trench warfare and carried those scars with him. His name would be given to the fortifications, though he did not live to see them completed. For Maginot and his supporters, the logic was clear. If trenches had worked as temporary defenses in the war, then a permanent trench line reinforced with concrete and steel would work even better. Construction began in 1929, and what followed was one of the most ambitious engineering projects of the 20th century. This was not a simple wall, nor a single row of bunkers. The Maginot Line was a network, a chain of fortresses stretching along France's eastern border with Germany and Luxembourg. Each fortress, called an ouvrage, was a complex of underground tunnels, living quarters, power plants, and artillery casemates. Soldiers stationed there could live and fight for weeks without ever leaving. Some of the largest ouvrages had their own underground railways, designed to move troops and ammunition from one section to another in complete safety. The line was designed with layers of defense. On the surface, there were concrete bunkers and machine gun nests, carefully camouflaged to blend with the landscape. Below ground, thick steel doors and armored turrets protected the entrances. Cannons were hidden behind retractable domes, able to rise, fire, and disappear before enemy artillery could target them. The designers thought of almost everything. The forts were supplied with their own water, food storage, air filtration, and electricity. In theory, a garrison could withstand siege conditions indefinitely. To the French public, the Maginot Line became a symbol of security. Newspapers called it impenetrable, a wall that no German soldier could ever hope to breach. Tour groups visited sections under construction, marveling at the vast tunnels and powerful guns. For a nation still traumatized by war, the Maginot Line was more than concrete. It was reassurance. Parents could look at their children and believe they would not be dragged into another slaughter like 1914. But beneath the optimism, cracks were already forming. One problem was geography. The Maginot Line did not stretch across France's entire border. To the north, along the Belgian frontier, the defenses were far lighter. France had hesitated to build heavily there because of politics. Belgium was an ally, and building a wall across its border risked signaling distrust. The French assumed that if Germany invaded again, it would come directly through Alsace and Lorraine. The same regions where battles had raged in World War I, the Maginot Line was built to cover that ground. But the open plains of Belgium remained vulnerable. Another problem was cost. The Maginot Line consumed an enormous share of France's defense budget during the 1930s. Billions of francs went into concrete, steel, and labor. And while the forts grew deeper and stronger, other areas of the French military fell behind. Tank production lagged, aircraft development was slow, and mobile forces received less attention. France had put so much faith in static defense that it overlooked the growing importance of speed and mobility in modern warfare. Still, to the ordinary soldier, the Maginot Line was impressive. Imagine being stationed in one of those underground forts in the 1930s. You descend deep below ground, passing through heavy blast doors into a vast tunnel system. Electric lights hum above your head. A narrow-gauge railway runs along the corridor, ready to carry ammunition to the gun turrets. You pass dormitories, kitchens, even recreation rooms. It feels more like a small underground city than a simple fortress. When you reach the artillery rooms, you find great armored turrets hidden beneath retractable steel domes. From there, you can aim at enemy positions without ever exposing yourself. The sense of safety was powerful. Soldiers joked that they were stationed in the underground hotels, comparing their accommodations favorably to the muddy trenches their fathers had known. And yet, the strength of the Maginot Line also bred a dangerous illusion. French commanders began to believe too much in its power. They imagined that if war came, Germany would smash against the wall and be stopped cold. The forts would hold the enemy long enough for French forces to mobilize and counterattack. In their minds, the line was not just a defense, but a guarantee. That belief would prove costly. While French planners saw the Maginot Line as an unbreakable barrier, German strategists studied it with growing interest. They recognized its strength, but also its weakness. A wall is only as strong as the ground it covers. And if the wall does not cover everything, then its strength can be bypassed. But that twist in the story comes later. For now, in the 1930s, the Maginot Line stood as a marvel of engineering and a symbol of French resolve. It was vast, imposing, and deeply reassuring to a nation scarred by war. It was the fortress of illusion, a wall built not only of steel and concrete, but of hope, fear, and the desperate desire to keep the nightmare of the trenches from ever returning. And if you're enjoying this dive into the strange and fascinating stories of history, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian. This is only the beginning of the Maginot Line story, and in the next parts, we'll uncover how this mighty fortress, believed to be France's salvation, would become its greatest trap. The Maginot Line, with its vast fortresses of steel and concrete, gave France the confidence that its eastern border was secure. Each fort was an underground city, stocked with weapons, supplies, and enough strength to resist a prolonged assault. To those who lived in its shadow, it seemed unbreakable. But behind the impressive engineering lay a dangerous assumption, one that would prove fatal in the years to come. The flaw lay not in the forts themselves, but in what was left between them. France had invested heavily in the line that stretched across Alsace and Lorraine. The traditional invasion routes where German armies had poured across during the First World War. But to the north, along the border with Belgium and Luxembourg, the defenses grew thinner and weaker. And in the middle of this gap stood the Ardennes Forest, a dense, rugged, and hilly region. French planners looked at the Ardennes and saw a natural barrier. Its thick woods, steep valleys, and winding rivers gave the impression of a fortress built by nature. Generals declared it was impenetrable to tanks, and engineers believed no modern army could march a mechanized force through such difficult terrain. If the Germans came again, they reasoned, they would not waste time sending armored divisions through the Ardennes. They would choose the easier path, the open plains of northern Belgium, where their forces could advance quickly. And so, the Ardennes was left largely unguarded, a gap in the French defenses that would one day become the door to disaster. To understand why this assumption took hold, you have to step into the mindset of the French High Command in the 1930s. Their vision of war was shaped by the First World War, a conflict dominated by trenches, barbed wire, and artillery. Tanks had played a role, but they were still considered clumsy machines that needed solid ground to operate effectively. Dense forests and narrow mountain roads seemed impossible for armored columns. Horses and infantry might pass, but not tanks, and certainly not entire armies supported by trucks, fuel, convoys, and artillery. French generals clung to this belief. The Ardennes was considered so secure that the government even posted fewer troops there. Instead of heavily fortified iverages like those in Lorraine, the Ardennes sector was dotted with small bunkers and light defenses. It was an economy of force. Why waste resources guarding what nature itself had already made impenetrable? But nature is only impenetrable if you assume the enemy shares your limitations. The Germans were not bound by French thinking. In the years leading up to the Second World War, German strategists studied the Ardennes with great interest. They saw the same hills, forests, and valleys, but instead of barriers, they saw opportunity. If the French were convinced the region was impossible for tanks, then that was exactly where the element of surprise could be achieved. The French fixation on static defense blinded them to the revolution happening in warfare at the time. While they poured billions of francs into bunkers and artillery turrets, Germany was developing new theories of mechanized warfare. Generals like Heinz Guderian were pushing the doctrine of Begangskrieg war of movement, where speed, concentration of force, and shock would replace the slow grind of trenches. Tanks were no longer clumsy support weapons. They were the spearhead, designed to punch holes through enemy lines and drive deep into the rear. Airplanes would provide cover, striking communication lines and paralyzing enemy movements. It was a doctrine built for mobility, the exact weakness of the Maginot Line. The French ignored these developments. Their military exercises in the 1930s still emphasized slow mobilization and set-piece battles. Even when some voices warned that the Ardennes might not be as impassable as assumed, those warnings were drowned out. The French commander-in-chief, Maurice Gamelin, famously declared that the Ardennes was impenetrable if properly defended. The problem was that it was not properly defended at all. Imagine being a French conscript assigned to the Ardennes sector in 1938. Instead of the underground fortresses your comrades enjoyed further south, you find yourself in a small blockhouse, barely larger than a farmhouse, with a thin layer of concrete protecting you. Your weapons are few, your supply is limited, and the dense forest stretches endlessly in front of you. You are told that the Germans will never come this way, that the terrain itself will keep you safe. It would have been hard not to believe it. After all, the Ardennes did not look like a battlefield where tanks could maneuver. But while the French soldiers trusted the forest, German planners tested and prepared. In 1938 and 1939, German armored divisions practiced moving through difficult terrain, developing methods to push tanks, fuel trucks, and artillery through tight valleys and over weak bridges. They mapped the roads of the Ardennes in detail. Where the French saw trees and hills, the Germans saw routes of advance. The fatal blind spot of the Maginot Line was not just geographical, it was psychological. The French convinced themselves that the Ardennes was secure, and in doing so, they created a hole in their defenses wide enough for an entire army. By concentrating on what had worked in the past, static fortifications and heavy defenses, they failed to imagine how a determined enemy might adapt. This kind of error is not unique to France. Throughout history, nations have often prepared to fight the last war, not the next one. The Maginot Line was built to stop a repeat of 1914, when German armies had smashed through northern France in a headlong rush. But warfare in 1940 was no longer the warfare of 1914. The tanks that had been slow and unreliable in the Great War were now fast, coordinated, and supported by aircraft. The Germans had transformed them into an offensive weapon unlike anything France had prepared to face. The Ardennes, once considered a shield, would soon become a highway. When German forces invaded in May 1940, they proved the French assumption catastrophically wrong. But even before that invasion, the seeds of failure were already visible. Engineers and generals had built the strongest fortifications imaginable against the wrong kind of war. And they had left the one place they believed invulnerable as their weakest point. The Maginot Line's fatal blind spot was not just a hole in concrete, it was a hole in imagination. France's leaders could not imagine that tanks could roll through the forest. They could not imagine that an enemy would risk the logistical nightmare of moving entire divisions through narrow mountain roads. They could not imagine that the very terrain they trusted would become their undoing. And so they built their great fortress on assumptions that would collapse as quickly as the bunkers in the Ardennes when the test finally came. In the spring of 1940, as Europe braced itself for the Second Great War in a generation, the French High Command was confident. The Maginot Line stood ready, a fortress stretching across the eastern frontier. Behind its walls, French soldiers believed they had the shield they needed to withstand any German assault. For months, as the world watched the so-called phony war, both armies sat in tense silence, waiting for the next move. When the German offensive finally came, it did not come where the French expected. Instead of smashing against the thick concrete of the Maginot Line, the Germans turned their gaze north. The man behind this daring move was General Erich von Manstein. one of the most brilliant military minds of the war. He understood what the French had failed to see. The Maginot Line was not just a fortress, it was a trap. For the French themselves, the original German plan, favored by many in the Wehrmacht, had been cautious. It resembled the Schlieffen Plan of World War I, a wide sweep through Belgium and into northern France. But Manstein saw the weakness in repeating history. The French were waiting for such a move, ready to send their best armies rushing into Belgium to block it. Instead, Manstein proposed something far more daring, a thrust through the Ardennes, the very place the French believed was impassable. It was a plan born of audacity and risk. The Ardennes was thick with forests, cut by narrow, winding roads and filled with steep valleys. Moving entire divisions, including tanks, artillery, and supply trucks, through this terrain seemed impossible. French generals dismissed it as a serious option. But for the Germans, the very impossibility of the idea was what made it so powerful. No one expected an army to emerge from those woods, and surprise in war is worth more than concrete walls. On May 10, 1940, the plan was set into motion. German forces surged into Belgium and the Netherlands, exactly as the French expected. The French and their British allies responded by sending their strongest armies north, leaving central France thinly defended. It was a perfect diversion. Meanwhile, hidden behind the Ardennes, the real strike force prepared to move. Imagine the scene in those early days. Long columns of panzers, trucks, and artillery snaked through narrow forest roads. The air was thick with the smell of fuel and exhaust. Soldiers marched in single file along paths barely wide enough for 2 men. At night, blackout orders kept convoys creeping forward in near silence. Headlights covered, engines muffled, the entire army moving like a shadow through the trees. Bridges creaked under the weight of tanks, some hastily reinforced with wooden planks to prevent collapse. The French had assumed the roads of the Ardennes could not sustain such movement, but the Germans proved otherwise. At the spearhead of this advance was General Heinz Guderian, the master of armored warfare. His panzers were not designed to crawl behind infantry, as the French still believed tanks should be used. They were built for speed, coordination, and shock, supported by radio communication, a crucial innovation the French lacked. The German armored columns advanced as a single, flexible unit. If one road became blocked, units quickly shifted to another. Engineers worked day and night to repair bridges, clear obstacles, and keep the momentum alive. By May 13th, just 3 days after the offensive began, the Germans reached the River Meuse near the town of Sedan. Here, the French had assumed the natural barrier of the river, and the difficult terrain of the Ardennes would hold back any serious threat. They had left only second-rate divisions to guard the area, reservists armed with outdated equipment and little training. These men were no match for what came next. The German assault on Sedan was brutal and precise. Waves of Stuka dive bombers screamed down from the sky, unleashing terrifying blasts on French positions. The psychological effect was devastating. Many French defenders broke under the bombardment before the ground assault even began. Under this cover, German engineers built pontoon bridges across the river, while panzers and infantry swarmed to secure the far bank. Within hours, the supposed natural barrier had been breached. For the French High Command, the realization came too late. Their armies were still locked in Belgium, fighting the diversionary German forces. While the real danger unfolded to the south, the Ardennes had been crossed in days, something they had believed impossible. Now, German armor poured into the French rear, bypassing the Maginot Line entirely. The genius of Manstein's plan was not just in the crossing itself, but in what followed. Once through Sedan, the German panzer divisions did not stop to consolidate or dig in. They raced westward, cutting deep into French territory with breathtaking speed. This was Blitzkrieg, lightning war in full display. While the French scrambled to reposition, German tanks advanced faster than their communications could keep up. Entire divisions were outflanked before they even realized they were under threat. Picture the chaos from the French perspective. In Belgium, French and British units believed they were holding the line. Suddenly, reports arrived that German tanks were behind them, racing toward the English Channel. Roads clogged with refugees and retreating soldiers, commanders struggled to get accurate information. Their outdated communication systems unable to match the speed of the German advance. Every day, the gap widened. Every hour, the French defenses collapsed further. The Maginot Line itself sat untouched, its mighty fortresses silent. Deep underground, French garrisons waited for an attack that never came. Soldiers in the fortresses could hear distant fighting, but saw no enemy. They were bypassed entirely, left irrelevant as the war swept past them. The billions spent on their construction meant nothing against an enemy that simply went around them. The breakthrough at Sedan marked the turning point of the entire campaign. By the end of May, German forces had reached the coast, cutting off the British Expeditionary Force and a large portion of the French army in northern France. What had begun as a bold gamble had turned into one of the most decisive maneuvers in modern military history, and it all hinged on that fatal blind spot, the Ardennes, written off by the French as impassable. The German bypass was not just a clever trick, it was a complete rethinking of how war could be fought. It turned the French assumptions against them, using speed, surprise, and mobility to outmaneuver a fortress that was never breached but still utterly defeated. As German tanks rolled out of the Ardennes and into the heart of France, the Maginot Line became a symbol not of strength but of misplaced faith. France had trusted its walls, its concrete, and its assumptions about the limits of modern war. Manstein and his generals proved that ingenuity and daring could shatter even the strongest defenses without firing a shot at them. The Maginot Line had been built with confidence, almost pride. Stretching across the French border with Germany, its concrete walls, underground tunnels, and heavy artillery looked indestructible. To anyone who visited before the war, it was a marvel of modern engineering, a fortress that seemed prepared for any attack. But by 1940, when the war began in earnest, the line revealed itself as a monument to an older age of warfare. It was designed for a siege that would never come, while the enemy used a kind of war the French had never prepared for. The French generals had poured their faith into the idea that strong walls could stop a modern invasion. They imagined German troops advancing on foot, artillery pounding against fortresses, tanks crawling slowly behind. They imagined trench warfare again, just like 1914 to 1918, only this time with France protected by concrete and steel. But the reality of the Second World War was different. The German blitzkrieg was fast, mobile, and devastating. It did not move toward the Maginot Line at all. Instead, it went around it. When the German army struck in May 1940, the French expected the battle to unfold along their fortified border. Instead, the Germans attacked through Belgium and the Netherlands, pulling the French and British armies north. The strongest Allied divisions left their positions to rush into Belgium, believing that was where the real battle would take place. Behind them, the German armored divisions poured through the Ardennes, a region the French had dismissed as impassable. It was a trap the French had built for themselves. The Maginot Line cost around 3 billion francs to construct, a staggering expense at a time when France was still recovering from the First World War and the Great Depression. Politicians sold it to the public as insurance. It was not just a wall of concrete, it was a wall of reassurance. Families who had lost fathers, brothers, and sons in the last war took comfort in believing this line would stop another invasion. But as German tanks rolled freely through the forests of the Ardennes, the value of those billions collapsed overnight. The fortresses stood silent, waiting for an enemy that never came. The soldiers manning the Maginot Line felt the weight of this futility. Deep inside bunkers, protected by meters of reinforced concrete, they were safe from bombs and shells, but they were also irrelevant. The war raged elsewhere. Some of these men sat underground, hearing distant thunder that was not weather, but artillery in Belgium. Others received frantic reports over the radio. German tanks had crossed the Meuse. The French lines were collapsing. Armies were retreating. Yet in their forts, nothing happened. No German attack came. Their weapons stayed silent, their training unused. For the German High Command, the Maginot Line was not an obstacle, but a background detail. They had no reason to throw men and machines against it, when speed and maneuver made it useless. Blitzkrieg was about striking where the enemy was weakest, about creating chaos and encirclement. In that sense, the line played right into their hands. It fixed the French mindset to one place, while the real war raced past them. As the Germans pushed deeper into France, the Maginot Line became a cage for French strategy. Commanders could not simply abandon it, because it represented years of planning and vast resources. They could not order the soldiers inside to march out, because the fortresses were designed to be defended, not easily abandoned. The underground structures had supplies for months of siege, food, ammunition, medical stores, but this very self-sufficiency made them rigid. They were places to sit and wait, not to move and fight. while the German panzers roared across northern France, cutting through Allied lines and racing toward the Channel. The Maginot Line garrisons waited. The contrast was almost absurd. On one side, war moved at lightning speed, tanks and aircraft coordinating in real time, entire divisions surrounded in days. On the other, French soldiers sat in darkness, the hum of generators echoing through tunnels, their guns pointed toward an empty horizon. They could do nothing as their nation fell around them. When German forces finally turned to deal with the Maginot Line, it was more of an afterthought. Once France had collapsed and surrendered in June 1940, the fortresses were isolated. Some garrisons fought briefly, refusing to believe their country had already fallen. At places like Schonenburg and Hackenberg, French crews fired their heavy guns, exchanging fire with German artillery and aircraft. But these battles were isolated, symbolic gestures rather than meaningful resistance. The bulk of the German army never faced the line because it did not need to. The irony was brutal. The Maginot Line, meant to shield France from invasion, never served its intended purpose. Instead, it exposed how quickly technology and strategy had changed. The line was built for a 19th century style of warfare, where battles were slow, sieges dragged on, and armies relied on fixed positions. But the 20th century had introduced tanks, fast-moving mechanized divisions, and air power that could paralyze defenses far from the front. Against this kind of war, a static fortress was little more than an expensive illusion. The contrast between cost and utility could not be more striking. Billions of francs invested in the most advanced engineering of its time, thousands of soldiers stationed underground. Endless hours of planning and construction, all undone by a plan that simply went around it. Imagine locking every door and window of your house against thieves, only to discover that they walked through the back garden and left with everything while you stood guard at the front door. That was the Maginot Line in 1940. For the French people, the collapse was devastating. They had been told that the line was their shield, that it guaranteed safety. Instead, it became a symbol of misplaced faith. Some soldiers trapped in the forts did not even learn of France's surrender until days later. Cut off from the outside world, still manning their guns while their government had already signed the armistice. Others marched out of the bunkers in disbelief, surrendering to an enemy that had never truly fought them. What made the failure sting even more was how the Maginot Line tied France to the past. It was the embodiment of lessons learned from the First World War, but not adapted to the realities of the next. The generals who built it thought of trenches, artillery barrages, and stalemates. They built walls to prevent a repeat of Verdun, but they had not understood how war had changed in just 2 decades. The Germans had built not walls, but a doctrine blitzkrieg that valued speed, shock, and flexibility over static defense. And so, when the test came, the Maginot Line did not collapse under German firepower. It did not crumble because its concrete was weak or its artillery was outmatched. It collapsed because it was irrelevant. It was a fortress waiting for a war that no longer existed. The French soldiers inside were not cowards. Many were brave, ready to fight, trained to withstand long sieges. But their bravery was wasted in stillness, their courage buried under concrete that faced the wrong direction. They became spectators in their own war, while their country was overrun. The Maginot Line's obsolescence was not just military, but symbolic. It showed how nations can cling to old strategies, pouring resources into weapons that no longer match the battlefield. France thought concrete could substitute for flexibility, that walls could think and adapt. But the Germans proved that no fortress, no matter how thick, could stand against an army that refused to fight the war it was built for. The fall of France in 1940 was not just a military defeat, it was a humiliation so complete that the entire world looked at the Maginot Line and saw a monument to strategic blindness. For years, French leaders had praised it as an unbreakable shield. It was proof, they said, that the nation had learned from the slaughter of the First World War. They claimed it was modern, unshakable, and backed by the most advanced engineering of the age. Yet in the space of weeks, that confidence collapsed. The German blitzkrieg rolled into France, and the Maginot Line's colossal investment of money, manpower, and pride was revealed as little more than an expensive mistake. The humiliation was not in the walls themselves. Technically, the Maginot Line did its job. The fortresses held against direct attack, guns fired as intended. Soldiers underground were safe from bombs and shells. The failure was not the concrete, it was the thinking behind it. The line was supposed to be a symbol of French resilience. Instead, it became a symbol of arrogance, of a nation so wedded to the past that it could not see the shape of the war unfolding before it. In the years leading up to the war, French generals believed they were preparing for the next conflict by building the line. What they were really doing was preparing for the last war. They remembered Verdun, the endless trenches, the slow, grinding battles of attrition. They thought the Germans would come at them the same way, hammering against the forts until they bled themselves dry. So they poured billions of francs into their wall. What they did not prepare for was an enemy that refused to fight on those terms. The Germans never challenged the Maginot Line head-on. They simply went around it. This bypass was more than a clever maneuver. It was a devastating psychological blow. Imagine standing guard over a safe filled with gold, armed to the teeth, every door locked and barred only, to find the thieves walked in through the side window you never bothered to secure. That was France in 1940. While the Maginot Line bristled with cannons and machine guns, the Germans drove their tanks through the Ardennes, a place French planners had dismissed as impossible. The very overconfidence in their defenses blinded them to the possibility of the unexpected. The result was chaos. French divisions rushed north to meet the German thrust through Belgium, leaving their flanks exposed. The German army sliced through the Ardennes and crossed the Meuse with shocking speed. Within days, entire French units were surrounded. The British Expeditionary Force was trapped, retreating toward Dunkirk. The most expensive and elaborate defensive line in the world stood silent, while the heart of France was cut apart in a matter of weeks. The Maginot Line became an international joke, but it was not funny to the French soldiers trapped inside. Some forts, like Schonenberg, continued to fight long after Paris had fallen. Men underground exchanged artillery fire with German units, not realizing their nation had already been defeated. In some cases, the garrisons only surrendered after being directly ordered to by their commanders. Stunned to learn that France had signed an armistice, imagine sitting in a fortress you believed to be the key to your nation's survival, only to discover it had become a tomb for your country's pride. The world watched and drew its own lesson. The Maginot Line was no longer a fortress, it was a warning. Military strategists around the globe studied its failure, noting that defense without flexibility is meaningless. The French had invested in concrete when they should have invested in mobility. They built walls when they should have built doctrines. They trusted engineering more than imagination. And when the war came, imagination won. The humiliation was sharpened by how icily Germany exploited French mistakes. The Blitzkrieg was not an unstoppable miracle, it was risky. It depended on coordination, and if the French had been prepared, it might have failed. But the French command structure was rigid, their communications slow, their leadership divided. While German generals took bold risks, French leaders clung to their fortifications, waiting for a battle that would never come. In the end, it was not that the Maginot Line was weak, it was that the French strategy was. That is why the line still haunts history. Not because it was useless, but because it represents the danger of misplaced confidence. The forts themselves were marvels of engineering, with underground barracks, power plants, and artillery turrets that could rise and fire before disappearing back into the earth. Yet all of it, every detail, was chained to an outdated idea of war. The line did not fail because it was poorly built. It failed because it was built for a world that no longer existed. The cost of that failure was not just money, it was national humiliation. France fell in 6 weeks, a country that had fought for 4 bloody years in the First World War, now collapsed in less than 2 months. German propaganda made full use of this, mocking the Maginot Line as a pathetic monument to French weakness. To the French people, it was worse than mockery. It was betrayal. They had been told this wall would save them. Instead, it left them exposed. This is why the Maginot Line has become shorthand for any grand plan that fails through arrogance and short-sightedness. It is invoked whenever leaders prepare for yesterday's battles instead of tomorrow's. It stands as a reminder that no wall, no matter how thick, can replace the need for vision. The French generals trusted in concrete, but war demanded speed, surprise, and adaptability. The line was not just bypassed on the battlefield, it was bypassed by history itself. The Maginot Line teaches us that technology and planning mean nothing without foresight. A fortress without imagination is just a prison. The French thought they were safe, but safety is an illusion when the enemy refuses to fight the way you expect. The humiliation of 1940 burned that lesson into history, and the world has not forgotten it. And that is the story of how the Maginot Line, once the pride of France, became a global symbol of failure. If you enjoyed this deep dive into one of history's greatest strategic miscalculations, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Dumb Historian for more stories of the past that reveal just how fragile power, pride, and planning can truly be.